Welcome back to another edition of the Hart2Heart Podcast. My guest today is Alex Leaf. Alex is an independent nutritional researcher who previously worked for Semen. He's very, very active on Twitter. He's great at correcting misinformation and people who are kind of just, putting out some nutrition fallacies. So Alex, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mike. Nice to be here.
So just before we get started, can you tell a little bit about yourself regarding to, what your background is and anything else that you want to mention?
Yeah. So I've kind of just been involved in nutrition and health research and writing. I like to say that I'm a scientific communicator for about 10 years now. I got started back in 2014 with examine.com. I was with them up until 2019. And then I switched over and now I work primarily alongside Ari Whitten at the Energy Blueprint. And I, do my own thing on the side too. I've published peer-reviewed studies, the most recent being the Keto ISSN position stand. And for about 2 years, I also helped teach at the University of Western States in their master's level human nutrition and functional medicine program.
All right. So you got, keep going.
That's about it.
I was going to say you got quite the background there. So anything more, I think, just would have been, just something that I would have been able to believe almost, because you've done so much just in the brief time you've been online. I shouldn't say brief time is, 10 years is quite a bit, but still you've accomplished a lot in those 10 years.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to get started with asking you some questions, more or less some things that you've researched, in the past and some of the things that you've researched, recently. The first question I have for you is, can collagen improve the appearance of skin?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, 100%. Zero ambiguity on this. And there was a recent meta-analysis, the biggest one to date that got, a lot of airtime on social media. And unfortunately, I feel like it's been kind of abused to promote this idea that collagen doesn't work. And when I say that because there's this kind of traditional, archaic method of saying anything with a p-value below 0.05 is statistically significant. And then things above that are not statistically significant. And because most people don't have any training in biostatistics, a lot of people, first of all, interpret this as meaning that if something is significant, there's an effect. And if something's not significant, there's no effect. And that's not true at all. You can have effects that are or aren't statistically significant. They aren't related. And then at the same time, people use this kind of arbitrary threshold to justify whether that effect exists or not. And the position that I take, and this is from, I have friends who have done like their PhDs in statistics and published papers and everything. And from talking with them, they're trying to push to move away from relying primarily on p-values because they can be super misleading. And so bringing it back to collagen, what the study showed is that overall, when you look at all the studies together, there is a benefit. But when you divide those studies up into subgroups, such as did it receive funding from industry or was it independent? Was it rated as a high quality intervention or was it low quality? When you divide it up like that, and then you look exclusively at high quality or no industry funding, then the effect is not statistically significant using that arbitrary cutoff value. But when you look at the data that's presented as a whole, the data overwhelmingly supports a trend towards a benefit, to the extent that, like, if you look at the confidence intervals, for skin hydration, for example, if you take that confidence interval and turn it into a scale of like 100%, 92% of the values within that confidence interval represent a benefit, and 8% represent no benefit. And so, you can look at that and be like, well, because there's that 8%, it's not significant. And that's what a lot of people did with this. And the reality is that, like, okay, it's not significant, but the overwhelming data is very congruent with there being an effect. And it's likely if we had more research published to further increase the statistical power to detect small differences, it would continue moving in that direction until it is fully significant. So,
Okay.
yeah, collagen definitely has an effect. And we have a number of human studies that document the exact mechanisms through which it occurs. Collagen isn't fully broken down into amino acids. There are bioactive collagen peptides that are absorbed intact that can be detected in your bloodstream after taking collagen. And then studies in rodents that label these peptides with isotopes to follow them around in the rodent's body show that they are directly incorporated into skin and joint tissue, and that they increase collagen synthesis locally in those areas. So the mechanisms there, the interventions that we have in humans are congruent with the benefit. So I say there's a benefit.
Okay. And so if someone does want to improve the appearance of their skin with collagen, how much should they be taking a day? And does it have to be taken with vitamin C?
So it's variable with collagen. Collagen kind of wears many hats too. If you're dealing with skin benefits exclusively, most studies use between 3 and 10 grams of collagen peptides, which would be the same as taking a collagen hydrolysate. And taking it with vitamin C is a good idea, although there's nothing I'm aware of that shows, what amount of vitamin C is optimal. Taking it with some vitamin C is a good idea because vitamin C is a necessary cofactor for the process of collagen synthesis in the body. And so you want to make sure that you have all the substrate available so your body can do the things it wants to do unimpeded.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for clearing that up, because I've kind of gone like back and forth on this. There was, a time where I said, this should definitely be, part of your, skin routine if you're looking to, make yourself look more youthful or just improve the appearance of your skin. And then I kind of did, I guess, get catfished a little bit on that study that you were talking about that came out that said that, when you look at the studies that are not, funded by the industry, that there doesn't seem to be an effect, which is, obviously false. So, I really appreciate you clearing that up. So I want to move to another topic that you actually kind of mentioned already, about the ketogenic diet. So are ketogenic diets beneficial for athletes?
They might be. So I'm going to start with where they might theoretically be beneficial. And the reason I say theoretically is because based on all the mechanisms that we know, it makes sense, but it's never actually been tested clinically. And that context is people who do ultra endurance events, like ultra marathons, running 100 miles, things like that. And the reason a ketogenic diet might be beneficial in that context is because it does unambiguously shift the body into being much better at using fatty acids as an energy source. And when you're doing super long distance endurance events, you are going at a very slow pace relative to when you're doing shorter events, which means that you're going at a pace where your body doesn't really need to use significant carbohydrates to keep it moving along. Like carbohydrates become less relevant to the performance. Now, so there could be a benefit from doing that. And then, on the flip side of that, everyone, or I shouldn't say everyone, but, a lot of the top athletes in these areas are consuming carbohydrates throughout the entire ultra endurance event. And I like to think that professional athletes are going to do what works optimally, because their entire job is based around performing at maximal capacity, right? And so if a ketogenic diet was super good for endurance performance in athletes, I would expect to see professional athletes start adopting the diet much more widespread than it is currently. And we just don't see that. Now, based on the systematic review that I published, we looked at all the published research on how a ketogenic diet compares to a higher carb diet in endurance athletes. And what we found is that when you're looking at exclusively elite level athletes doing endurance events that are shorter than a marathon, the ketogenic diet reduces performance. They run more slowly. Their finish times aren't as good. They get fatigued more easily. And that's because when you're an elite athlete, even the top of the top for a marathon, which is 26 miles, they're still running at a pace that is fueled almost 100% by carbohydrate. So they're going super intense, and you need carbohydrates to even achieve that intensity, because burning fat is a slow process. It simply cannot provide energy quickly enough to allow you to operate at that intensity. Now, in recreational athletes, overall, there is really no effect of a keto diet, good or bad. And my hypothesis with this is just that, recreational athletes aren't pushing up against their genetic limit. And so dietary influences are just much less relevant to what their performance is in the long run.
So if people are doing, say, 60-minute sessions of zone 2 cardio, doesn't really make that much of a difference whether you're on a ketogenic diet or not.
No. And you also have to separate goals too. A lot of people just do cardio to improve their health. And so you could be on whatever diet you want, and the cardio is going to improve your health. But if you're looking to maximize your performance or to be competitive in a sport, then the evidence we have so far suggests that you're going to need to be eating sufficient carbohydrate in your diet.
What about ketone esters? I don't know if there's any even danger to this, but supplementing with ketone esters while on a high carbohydrate diet, so you kind of have both during a race. Is that something that's been studied, or do you think that could be beneficial or dangerous maybe in some ways?
I wouldn't say it's dangerous. I mean, as long as you're not being crazy with the ketone esters. There are a handful of studies that have been published looking at how they affect performance. And when they're combined with carbohydrates, performance does seem to be improved. So I think there's potential there. But then the question becomes, well, do you use ketone bodies during your endurance event, or do you use glucose and carbohydrate mixtures, right? And I don't know if there's been any kind of head-to-head comparison about what would improve performance more than the other.
Okay. So just staying on the topic of diet, after hitting about 1 gram of protein per pound a day, is there any beneficial effects of adding more protein, or would carbohydrates then be a better source for athletes overall?
So it depends on your goals. For the athlete that is looking to maximize their performance, I would definitely say that's sufficient protein. Get your carbohydrates in, and get your fats in too. I think fats are important. For an athlete, let's say a bodybuilder, even just, a fitness enthusiast that wants to either cut down and get their abs showing, or if they want to bulk up, eating higher protein up to about 3.3 grams per kilogram, which was 1.5 grams per pound of body weight. That's been shown to be better during dieting for preserving muscle mass and preferentially burning body fat. And then when you're overeating, that has been shown to not increase your lean mass gains any more than lower protein intake, but it does inhibit body fat storage. And so these people gain less body fat during the period of overeating while gaining similar amounts of lean mass as people eating like 1 gram per pound. And so I do think there's benefits for body composition in that regard.
Okay. So basically you can go more than 1 gram per pound a day. And then if you are in, a caloric deficit, going up to say like 1.5 grams per pound a day may help you just retain more lean mass. And then also too, you're likely to burn more fat if you are within that threshold. Is that correct?
Yeah. And I want to emphasize that's just for people who are already relatively lean.
Okay.
So if you're overweight or obese, or you have excess body fat to lose, there's probably no dieting benefit of going above 1 gram per pound, but there's also no harm. And so, if you find that it helps you stick with your diet, then there's no reason to not do it.
Okay. But do you think that you would still need some carbohydrates, even if you're in that 1 to 1.5 gram per pound range, of protein per pound a day? Would you still need like extra carbohydrates for performance, like for just recovering and just, having more energy in the gym?
Yeah. I mean, especially if you're dieting, I think that would be important. I will say that in the same systematic review that we did with endurance athletes, we also looked at strength athletes, and there weren't any studies in like elite strength athlete classes. But recreationally speaking, there didn't seem to be any effect of a keto diet on strength performance in the gym compared to higher carbohydrate diets. So, I personally like having people eat relatively high protein diets, solid amount of carbohydrates if they're metabolically healthy, and then a healthy amount of fats. But I'm totally open to people, going keto if they want. And I don't think in the grand scheme of things, it would have a huge effect on their strength performance. And there's also an individual component, there's no reason to box yourself into any one diet. You can try different things and find the one that seems to work best for you.
Yeah. And, talking about different types of diets, is there any advantage to intermittent fasting versus caloric restriction?
Ooh, that's a contentious topic. My position would be yes. So there's a lot of studies out there that suggest that it, like in the grand scheme of things with body composition, there's just no difference so long as, your calorie deficit over the course of the week is equivalent. In my personal experience, I've found that intermittent fasting can be really helpful with adherence, especially for people who have excess amounts of body fat, or the other one is smaller women. And I'll talk about each of those. People with excess body fat, there is such a thing as like food addiction. And so I find that it can be easier for them mentally to just have days or time periods where they don't eat. And by condensing their eating window, they can also, kind of be a little more lenient with what they eat in that window. Obviously we're not going to support binging or going off the rails or any of that stuff, but they can usually eat more in, maybe like 2 or 3 meals pushed into a 6 to 8 hour window, and feel fuller at each meal and still get that energy deficit than if they spread their meals out over a longer time period. For smaller women, similar issue. They have very low energy expenditure because they're tiny, right? They don't need a lot of calories to keep them alive. And unfortunately, that means that when they diet, they usually need to either increase their activity a bunch or push their calories really low. And so I find that letting them, I'll usually do a blend where they eat normally for like 4 days out of the week. And then on 3 of those days, I'll have them cut out a meal and fast through it. And that kind of creates that deficit that we're looking for over the course of the week without hurting, their nutrient requirements, and also, without them feeling like they're restricting constantly.
Okay. What about its effects on autophagy? Is there any truth to that, or autophagy?
I wouldn't say that I wouldn't say there's anything unique about fasting in that regard. Most of the benefits of fasting come from creating an energy deficit, right? It's just that fasting is like as big of an energy deficit as you could possibly get, right? Because it's 0 calories.
And then it also can create, as you said, more or less like a better relationship with food with people who
I think so. In my experience, it can. But yeah, autophagy with fasting, it's not unique to fasting. You get autophagy anytime you're in an energy deficit, and you get autophagy when you exercise even more than when you're fasting. And there was a really, really cool study that was done in this regard that had people fast for 12 hours overnight. They measured markers of autophagy. Then they had them fast for 36 hours, measured markers of autophagy. And then they had them do a 12-hour fast followed by 60 minutes of zone 2 cardio. And markers of autophagy were like twice as high as fasting for 36 hours at the end of that 60-minute session following a 12-hour fast, because it needed a lot more energy in that time period, right?
Okay.
And then what they did is they took these people, they had them do that again, but they injected glucose. They hooked them up to an IV and just fed glucose into their bloodstream during the cardio session. And levels of autophagy dropped, but they were still equivalent to 36 hours of fasting.
Wow.
So it is 100% the extent of the energy deficit you're creating. That's what drives autophagy. Now, a lot of the data on, timelines of like autophagy happening and everything comes from rodent models. Those aren't applicable to humans at all when there's anything to do with fasting. And that's because if their metabolic rate is 7 times faster than that of a human when corrected for body size. So if I need 3,000 calories per day, if I were a mouse at my same body size, I would need 21,000 calories. And of course, if you fast them with those huge of energy requirements, the effects are going to be much more extreme. Mice lose 15% of their body weight after 16 hours of fasting. After 5 days of fasting, they die. So fasting is a tremendous stressor on them compared to a human. And to exemplify this, if you fasted a mouse for 16 hours, it increased mitochondrial biogenesis. So the creation of new mitochondria, it increased those levels after just 16 hours of fasting in a mouse. They then did this in humans, and they found no change in those markers even after 72 hours of fasting, which means, humans are probably going to need days to equate to what we see in a mouse in like a shorter time frame. There's studies saying your immune system resets after 3 days of fasting. That was in a mouse. That's equivalent to 21 days in humans, assuming it happens at all. So timelines of autophagy are all completely irrelevant to humans. We don't know what the timeline in humans is. What we do know is that it's related to the energy deficit you create. So whether you're chronically dieting or doing intermittent fasting or whatever, or exercise, it's all ultimately just depends on your deficit.
Okay. Yeah, I know a lot of people are really into intermittent fasting, so I just wanted to clear up that question. Are seed oils killing us, or are they just like really unfairly demonized?
I think they're unfairly demonized. I personally, I'll preface this by saying that I don't eat seed oils. Most of my fats, I don't like using added fats in general. And I think if we made everyone stop using added fats, health would improve. And that goes for any type of added fat. I much prefer to get my fats from whole food sources. But I've never seen a human intervention study showing that seed oils have a harmful effect compared to something like saturated fat. And the mechanisms of seed oils aren't really well established in humans in the way that the people who think they're killing us do. They tend to rely heavily on extrapolation from isolated mechanisms in test tubes or animal studies. And a lot of that just might not necessarily be applicable to humans. So I think they're unfairly demonized, but I also see no reason to consume them. I think added fats in general are just like added sugars, and they're best avoided. So in a way, I could say seed oils have a net detrimental effect, but not because of something unique to the seed oil. It would be the same if we replaced all seed oils with tallow, then it would be the exact same outcome.
Yeah, I kind of feel, the same way. And like before, this kind of seed oil thing blew up on social media, like I never consumed seed oils in my diet anyway. Basically I use avocado oil for cooking.
Yeah.
And in the rare instance that, I do make a salad at home, like I'll use olive oil. And that's pretty much it. Like I get all of my other fats just from, whole foods, kind of like you do. The one thing I will say about it, and this is just a blood work result that I got back recently this week. So, about 3 months ago, and it might be being a little bit tedious here, I did a fatty acid profile, and I was a little bit, I guess, surprised because my omega-6 to omega-3 ratio was like 6.18, something like that. And I was consuming 5 mils of fish oil a day. So about 2 grams of EPA, 1 gram of DHA. And 6-to-1 is not too bad overall, but ideally, you want to get it somewhere between 2-to-1 or 4-to-1 if you can. And so I was consuming a lot of almond butter at that time, which does have a lot of arachidonic acid, can convert to omega-6s. And I was consuming a decent amount of fish oil, but not a ton. And so I stopped eating any almond butter almost completely, switched over to macadamia nut butter and macadamia nuts, which essentially have no omega-6s in them. And then I doubled up my fish oil. I was taking, another 2 grams of EPA just isolated per day on top of the 5 mils that I was taking. So 4 grams of EPA total, 1 gram of DHA. And then I just got my blood work back and it was about 1.5. So I kind of overshot of omega-6 to omega-3, which I was, super pleased with. And so I just kind of feel like the same as you, like when I look at the studies, I see that, when you replace, seed oils with saturated fat, things usually tend to improve overall, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to start adding them to my diet. And then I'm also looking at my omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. And if, I already wasn't like, optimal, and again, 6-to-1 isn't too bad. Why would I add, seed oils into my diet? Right. And so, I just wanted to add that tidbit there just because I did get that blood work back recently. And so, that's sort of the way I look at seed oils is that, there's no reason to add them. If I'm out somewhere and there's like, a minimal amount, or I find an ingredient and there's, again, it's just used as like an emulsifier or something like that. I'm not going to really worry about it, but I certainly am not going to start adding them to my diet.
Yeah.
Anyways, I'll kind of move on from there. So something that you've talked about recently, and I know this has been kind of a buzz on social media. So Are there any benefits to not ejaculating frequently, or what people are calling semen retention?
Oh man. So no. And I wrote a blog post about this, but believe it or not, there has actually been peer-reviewed published studies where the researchers just look at what are the claims about semen retention on social media platforms and how accurate are they? So they actually scoured, TikTok and Twitter. It was Twitter at the time, and looked at what are people saying, and they reviewed thousands of claims. They grouped them all into general categories, and what they found is that 0% of the claims that are on social media were true based on scientific research. 0, which is insane. So if you come across something on social media about this, you can ignore it pretty much. But no, there's no unique health benefits. The only effects semen retention have are actually negative. So from a fertility standpoint, the longer that your sperm sit, because sperm are made every day, and they go through a process that takes about 72 days for them to fully mature. And part of this process has them sitting in a little organ, if I can remember the name, it's called like the epididymis. And when they're sitting here maturing, they're very vulnerable to oxidative stress. And so the longer that you go without ejaculating, the more oxidative stress they accumulate. And we see that as DNA fragmentation increasing. And in, assisted reproduction studies, this actually associates with pregnancy rates. So if you have a bunch of women going through IVF, for example, and then you do a comparison of, okay, let's compare now the pregnancy rates by dividing these patients up based on how long their partner, their husband, abstained before giving their sample. And it would go anywhere from 1 day, 2 day, 3 day, 4 day, or 5 or more days. And it was basically linear. Pregnancy rates were highest with the shortest time of abstainment, and pregnancy rates went down the longer that they abstained. And it's because the sperm degrades basically, and it becomes lower quality. Outside of that, we have data showing that, not ejaculating increases your risk of prostate cancer as a man. And it also is associated with greater unhappiness and even, a greater risk of dying. Although for the greater risk of dying, I think it's reverse causality, where people who are like really sick and they're going to die just don't have sex or don't ejaculate very frequently because, they're sick and dying. But yeah, there's no benefits to it. The best outcomes from
so it doesn't increase testosterone in any way whatsoever?
No,
okay.
No, definitely
and it doesn't
not.
affect like athletic performance in any way?
Nope, definitely not.
Okay. Even if you did it, even if you ejaculate like an hour or two before a game, something like that, like it wouldn't affect
it's not.
performance?
There's nothing to support that does any of that. And, there's an individual component. So, let's call it a placebo effect. If you find that when you ejaculate, your productivity afterwards goes down, maybe your performance in the gym goes down, whatever, then it doesn't really matter what's causing it for you, whether it's placebo or not. Just don't do it before that thing happens. For me personally, I always find that, after I have sex with my wife, I'm much more productive and energetic, and I'm much better able to take on the day. So I prefer to have as very little retention as possible because I do my best when I don't. Yeah. And other people might be different.
Yeah. It might just be like a superstition thing for some people.
Yeah.
But yeah, thanks for clearing that up, because that's been, certainly buzzing around on social media for a while there now. Another myth that I wanted to ask you about, well, I think it's a myth anyway, is does soy really lower testosterone?
No, No, a long time ago, probably like 7 years ago, I think, I reviewed the data on this for Examine and wrote a blog article for them. And overwhelmingly, when you look at the meta-analyses we have of, like 25 studies from the one I remember, where it's an intervention where they give people high isoflavone soy isolate protein powders incorporated into their diet and then monitor testosterone after 8 to 12 weeks, there's no effect on testosterone.
What about on estrogen?
No effect on estrogen either. So the way soy works is the isoflavones in soy you can think of them as estrogen mimetics. So they have an affinity for binding estrogen receptors that is weaker than the actual estrogen hormone in your body. And this can be a double-edged sword. So with women, for example, if you have excessively high estrogen, it can actually help balance that out by blocking estrogen from binding to the receptors. If you have too low estrogen, it can give you that estrogen effect and bring you back up to a kind of a healthy level. And so in women, soy has been shown to help with things like PMS and going through menopause, because it helps kind of balance estrogen no matter where it's at. In men, the only effect that I've ever seen soy have is it lowers your risk of cancer in men.
Is that just across the board, or is that like a particular kind of cancer?
Primarily prostate cancer, but it's not an effect that's mediated by testosterone or estrogen, because those hormone levels in men do not change with estrogen consumption. And there's no basis either for soy to increase estrogen in men, because estrogen in men is made from testosterone that's converted through the aromatase enzyme. If you just take phytochemicals that bind to estrogen receptors, it's not affecting the pathway of estrogen synthesis at all. They're just having their own unique binding effect on those receptors. If you're a man with high estrogen, it'll block estrogen's effects. If you have very low estrogen, it'll give you some more estrogen effects. The only time I've ever seen it negatively affect a male is there's been 2 case studies of people one of them was in a vegan where their diet was like 80% soy foods. And after 6 months, they developed hypogonadism and they started like growing breasts. But their intake of soy was like insanely high, like 80% of all the food that they ate were soy products. So it's not really realistic to what typical soy consumption would look like. The other case study, the guy was drinking 3 quarts of soy milk every day for 8 months, and he'd started growing breasts as well. So yes, high amounts of isoflavones in men can have negative effects when you're like talking stupid high levels, right? Like a toxicity threshold. But if we're just talking about soy incorporation into the diet in general, then we don't see these effects at all.
And just one more question about the hormones. It doesn't affect DHT either in any way? Dihydrotestosterone?
I don't know that one off the top of my head. I don't know that one.
Okay. Got you. Yeah, I think I maybe saw one, mechanistic study on it, but, certainly nothing confirmed right now. So, yeah, thanks so much for clearing that up, though. Keeping on the topic of protein, some people maybe over-rely on, whey protein to get their protein intake. So, what percentage of your protein intake should be from whey protein?
I don't think there really is an answer to that,
Like if you want to go for 200 grams a day, like you wouldn't say, make sure you're not eating more than say, 50 grams of whey. Make sure that the other 150 grams comes from whole foods or anything like that.
No, if somebody wanted to consume all of their protein for the day as whey protein, I don't think there would be an issue doing that, so long as they make sure that they are otherwise eating a nutrient sufficient diet, or if they're, doing something like a protein sparing modified fast, making sure that they're taking supplements so that they're getting all the nutrients their bodies need. The only reason I could think of where taking all that whey would be problematic is because it pushes out foods that are more diverse in the nutrients they provide your body. And so you could inadvertently cause nutrient deficiencies or insufficiencies. But it's not intrinsic to the whey itself. And, whey protein is literally the highest quality protein that humans have discovered. And breast milk is actually 60% whey protein. So it's fundamentally the protein that humans are quite most adapted to consuming.
Yeah. I was really surprised when I compared actually whey protein to, beef protein. Some people are consuming beef protein and, they think that it's better just because, we associate beef with, building muscle and protein and that kind of thing. But if you look at the amino acid profile, and maybe this, doesn't account for actually eating beef. I'm just talking about beef protein here. The amino acid profile for whey protein is significantly better, meaning you're getting I think it's 3 to 5 times the amount of branched chain amino acids. We know that leucine is really important out of, the branched chains for muscle building. And so, like you said, you absorb 99 to 100% of the protein from whey. So it is a fantastic source of protein overall.
Yeah. No, about 60% of the amino acids in whey are essential amino acids, compared to 45 to 50% for most other animal-based, whole foods like beef or even eggs. So yeah, whey protein's just in a category of its own. Whenever anyone is looking for a protein supplement, whey protein's always my first recommendation. And then there's people who won't use it for whatever reason, because they don't like the way it makes them feel, or maybe they're vegan and so they don't consume it. And then you look to other options, but whey is always the starting point for what I recommend.
And is there any truth to this kind of special 2-hour eating window after you work out where you can absorb more protein? And some people also believe in that 2-hour eating window that your insulin sensitivity is higher, so you can ingest more carbs without necessarily gaining weight.
So post-exercise, your ability to digest and absorb food is actually lower, because during the event of exercise, you create heat stress and you divert blood away from your digestive organs. And this causes some intestinal permeability. And so what we actually see is when you give protein immediately after, doing an hour of exercise, the anabolic response is blunted compared to waiting, 30 minutes to an hour afterwards. Just because your body needs a minute to reset. And when you're talking a protein supplement, that moves through you quick. So, it's actually better if you do just wait for a minute and let your body kind of cool down and then eat something.
That's probably convenient for people who, go to the gym and then drive home and then consume protein, because, it gives them that kind of little buffer window.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking now, you kind of related this to heat. So if someone did the sauna and they got their body temperature up, say they got it up pretty high, past 38.5, then would that have the same effect as, say, after exercise? Would that also be a detrimental or not a good time to consume whey protein?
100%.
Okay.
Exercise-induced intestinal permeability is an actual thing that happens. It's studied extensively in scientific research. And even though they say it's exercise induced, it is linked directly to heat and the increasing of core body temperature during exercise itself.
Excellent. Okay. That's, kind of news to me. I didn't think that was going to be the answer. So thanks for clearing that up. What about the insulin sensitivity thing? can you consume more carbs within that 2-hour window without gaining more weight, or is that kind of a myth as well?
I've never seen kind of a comparative study in that regard, but your insulin sensitivity is not going to decrease if you delay food. Part of the reason why insulin sensitivity increases is because you deplete muscle glycogen, which means now your muscles are more receptive to taking up glucose and restoring it. And whether you have carbs right after you work out or, hours later, it's not going to make a difference in that regard. Now, do muscle contractions themselves stimulate the translocation of GLUT4 receptors to the muscle fiber membrane surfaces? Yes. So mechanistically, could you, take up more carbohydrate immediately after working out? Yes, in theory, but I don't know if it's ever been tested, and I don't know if it would make a difference in the real world.
Okay. And talking about insulin sensitivity, like a lot of people will, not eat too much during the day. I mean, some people do the intermittent fasting and then they'll consume, most of their carbohydrates at night. But should it actually be the reverse? Like, are we actually more insulin sensitive in the morning and in the afternoon at night? And so would you suggest to people that if you are going to consume carbohydrates, you should consume more of them actually during the day than at night?
So that depends on body comp. So when you look at studies with people with obesity and type 2 diabetes, yes, they are more insulin sensitive in the morning. But that's in part because their metabolism's already screwed up. In lean people and athletes, it's the opposite. They're actually more insulin sensitive at night. And the reason for that is because after an overnight fast, they are relying primarily on fatty acids as the energy source. And, the Randall cycle basically describes how when you're relying primarily on fat, that interferes with your ability to use glucose and vice versa. And so when you take a lean athlete, they're quite insulin resistant in the morning because they have all of this fat that is being released because, without any issue, they're insulin sensitive. So their body's really good at having energy flux. So all this fat's in their bloodstream. That's what they're burning for energy. And so in the morning, their fat tissue might be more insulin sensitive, but their muscle tissue is more insulin resistant because their muscle tissue is burning all these fatty acids.
Okay.
So, that's a
good answer, because I think a lot of people are confused about this. And, I was always in the camp that, you should eat more of your carbohydrates in the night, but, I heard some people recently kind of say the opposite. So, that's interesting that it depends upon, the body composition.
Yeah. And here's the other part of that too. I find that athletes, lean people, people that are active, they sleep better when they eat carbohydrates closer to bedtime, because fundamentally carbohydrates signal to the body that you are well fed. Like they have that effect. Part of that's because of the insulin response they evoke. Insulin is a powerful hormone acting in the brain to induce satiety, and carbohydrates help increase synthesis of serotonin, which is the precursor to melatonin. And so when you eat a bunch of carbs before bed, it basically pushes your body into saying, wow, we're well fed. We can relax. We're now going to, have more melatonin when the lights go off. And it just helps with sleep. My wife, she hangs out around like 16% body fat just because that's her preference. And the only way she can sleep through the night is if she eats a big meal of, she'll eat carbohydrates at dinner, and then she'll have another snack, just close before she goes to bed, with a few more carbohydrates in it, and she sleeps through the night. If she skips, even if she has the carbohydrate dinner, if she skips that pre-bedtime carbohydrate snack, she'll end up waking up at like 2 or 3 in the morning because she'll have ran out of liver glycogen overnight. And when your liver runs out of glycogen, runs out, like not literally, but when it gets super low, your body says, we need more glucose. And how do they get it? They need to somehow stimulate the liver to create more glucose from other substrates. And the way it does that is through stress hormones. And so a lot of women will actually wake up between 1 and 3 a.m. And it's because they're running out of liver glycogen, they're getting a rush of adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol to tell the liver, we need more glucose to be made. And that wakes them up as a side effect of that stress response. And so, when she works with clients, with women, she always tells them, eat a heavy carbohydrate dinner. And if you need to, try a snack before bedtime as well. And her success rate with getting them to sleep through the night is like 100%.
That's amazing. So really then, if you are lean and if you're metabolically healthy, and you want to sleep better at night, then you basically should save up your carbohydrates, for the PM or for dinner and pre-bed.
Yeah. And if you're somebody who combines it with intermittent fasting, that's the optimal setup, especially because in the morning, you're already running on fat. You can wake up, skip a meal. You'll have, usually you have more energy. You have some caffeine, like you're good to go. And then you get a nice, meal a little later in the day to break your fast. And that meal can be whatever, but, making sure you're getting all those carbohydrates at night before you go to bed, it really just sets you up for success for the next morning.
Okay, so we know about, just want to dive into this a little bit. So we know, eat a high carb meal at dinner, and we're talking maybe like 3 to 4 hours, because obviously with dinner, you're going to have some fats and protein in there as well. So I'm thinking, you want to do it at least 3 to 4 hours before bed, because you don't want a big heavy meal before bed. And then say, 1 to 2 hours before, or maybe it can be a half hour before, some further or more carbohydrates could be beneficial. And so when we're talking about those particular carbohydrates, like what carbohydrates should they be? Are there ones that would actually be detrimental versus ones that would be better? And what is the exact timing? Like, is a half hour okay? Is even 15 minutes okay? Or should it be, still about 1 to 2 hours before bed?
So I would say, the snack is usually like maybe an hour before you fall asleep.
Okay.
For a lot of women, it's as simple as taking like a tablespoon of honey, and maybe with a little salt. My wife, she buys these like pea protein chips. But they only have like maybe 15 grams of carbs for a little bag. It's like 130 calories. And she'll eat those with a little salsa. And that's her preferred snack. So, you can play around with things, figure out what works for you. But for the pre-bed snack, you shouldn't need more than, I would say, 15 to 30 grams of carbohydrates.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thanks for clearing that up, because I know there's a lot of people, struggling out there with sleep. And also, I've noticed that people who do the ketogenic diet do often, struggle with sleep at night. And I've heard Andrew Huberman talk about it on his podcast before as well. Regarding protein, like, is it okay for people to have, say, like 100 grams of protein in, or 200 grams of protein, so 100 grams, twice per day? Or does it have to be, say, 30 to 40 grams, like 6 times per day? Is there an advantage to one over the other, or does it all kind of balance out and equally overall?
So, like, mechanistically and theoretically, spreading it out over more meals would be superior, because protein synthesis specific to your muscle tissue, muscle protein synthesis, it kind of caps out when you're dealing with the highest quality proteins, so whey and egg proteins. It caps out, somewhere around 40 to 50 grams. It's higher in people who are older because they have anabolic resistance, so they're less responsive to amino acids. So older people actually need more in a single meal to get that same effect as a younger person. But we have studies showing, using like one study, for example, compared 70 grams of protein to 40. And what they found is that muscle protein synthesis was the same in both groups, and so was muscle protein breakdown. Net protein balance in muscle tissue was equivalent, but protein synthesis for the entire body was higher with the 70 grams compared to the 40. And, that makes sense because muscle protein synthesis accounts for only 20 to 30% of all protein synthesis in the body. And so if you're eating higher meals, it's not being wasted. It's just being used for other things. Now, if your goal is to be a professional bodybuilder and maximize muscle growth, then yeah, eating like 30 to 40 grams of protein every, 3 to 4 hours is optimal, theoretically, for making sure that muscle protein synthesis stays as elevated as it can throughout the day. But when you were just talking about 99% of people, including athletes, then they don't need to be that neurotic about it. And if they want to eat, 2 meals with 100 grams each, it's not going to go to waste.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think that's, helpful for a lot of people because, I think, for the most part, people do prefer to have some snacks throughout the day and not necessarily, just eat all their meal in one particular, sitting. And so, it's good to know, the difference between those two. I do want to ask you, I know this is, a bit of I don't know if it's a loaded question, but I know it's kind of difficult to answer. Is a calorie a calorie?
Well, yeah. Because if 1 calorie equals 1 calorie, right? And I know where you're going with this, where a calorie is a calorie 100%, but when you're looking at human physiology, we're not talking about the calories in the food. We're talking about the calories that are absorbed into the body. And so if you eat, a piece of bread and you were to eat an equivalent amount of carbohydrates from broccoli, even though you're eating the same amount of carbohydrates from each, the net available carbohydrates that make it in your body is going to be much less in the broccoli because of all the fiber that is going to interfere with the digestion and absorption of those carbs. So a calorie is a calorie, but depending on your diet's composition, people are going to be absorbing and having available different amounts of calories from the foods that they're consuming. And this is one reason why, people get screwed up when it comes to energy balance because, maybe they're eating like a typical Western diet, just as an example. And then they switch their diet. Maybe they go keto, maybe they go, vegan or whatever. It doesn't really matter. They just switch to some type of maybe a healthier diet that's not a Western diet. And it's not just about calories. They say, well, I can eat more now. And it's like, okay, yeah, you can eat more, but you're either absorbing less of those calories or, if you're eating more protein, for example, your metabolic rate has increased. So energy balance still applies. It's just you've moved like 20 different levers at the same time. So you can't really this doesn't disprove energy balance at all. So, when we talk about calories in, calories out, that does apply, but only if you're consistent with what you eat and what you do. So if I have a standard diet, and I eat the exact same foods every day, then I can start to increase or decrease the amounts of those foods. And it will directly correlate to changes in my body composition and my body weight because the absorption capacity of that diet remains stable. And now we're just dealing with moving calories up and down.
Okay. So yeah, just to kind of simplify that. So say you're eating, 3,000 calories a day, and then you increase it to 4,000 calories a day. but the macronutrients are, they wouldn't be equivalent, but in terms of like the increased volume, they would be equivalent. Say like you're still eating 40%, protein, 30% carb, 30% fat, just for arbitrary sake. And then, the exact same foods, but just again, more volume. Then in that situation, your body composition and things are going to change because, the calories are equal to one another. But if someone has a 3,000 calorie diet and it's, say, 10% fat and 80% carb and then 10% protein, then you can't really look at, and it equals, say, 3,000 calories versus the other person, then you can't necessarily compare those two to one another. So, that makes total sense overall. I do want to ask you about this. So I know that you appeared or debated with Dr. Paul Saladino, or the Carnivore MD. I know this was, a few years ago now. So what do you think he gets right and what do you think he gets wrong?
Man, well, I definitely think his views have changed since I debated him. Anyone looking at him now, he consumes lots of fruit. He even consumes like white rice. And that was because his low carb carnivore diet was destroying his testosterone and his energy levels and all of that. And now he's doing a lot better. So for that, I give him props because he's clearly open-minded enough in that regard to where he's not getting tied down in any one dietary ideology. Now, I think he pushes people to eat whole foods and minimize their intake of ultra-processed foods. And I think that that's great. I think that is fundamental to improving the health of pretty much anyone. However, I do think he tends to get bogged down in mechanisms more than hard outcome data. And so it's really fun and interesting to, look at what are the mechanisms through which something occurs, and then to draw all of these conclusions about that thing. And those mechanisms, understanding those mechanisms is definitely important, but you can't lose sight of, well, what happens when we actually make these changes in humans? What happens? And we see that if we go back to the seed oil thing, we see that there where they have all of these intricate, like delicate mechanisms of how seed oils hurt human health. Yet virtually every intervention study we have shows that seed oils do not hurt human health. In fact, for the most part, they improve health outcomes compared to saturated fat. And when you focus on those mechanisms, you not only lose sight of that, but you also, risk cherry picking the mechanisms you want to look at. So if we stick to the seed oil versus saturated fat, I see a lot of talk about mechanisms about oxidized, fatty acids and how that's damaging. But we know that when you heat up saturated animal fats, you oxidize the cholesterol that they contain. And human studies using isotopic tracers have actually found that if you feed someone oxidized polyunsaturated fatty acids, they circulate in lipoproteins and they're cleared in the body in about 2 to 3 days. Or I'm sorry, they're cleared in about 72 hours. And if you then give them oxidized cholesterol, like they would get if we use tallow for deep frying instead of soy oil, that oxidized cholesterol stays in circulation for 5 to 7 days. So it stays circulating even longer. And, I've never seen any of them address this topic about when you cook saturated animal fats, you're oxidizing the cholesterol within them. And that is damaging to humans in the same way that consuming oxidized fatty acids would be. And it circulates in your body longer, which means there's a greater opportunity for bad things to happen before your body clears it out.
Interesting. Okay, yeah, I didn't know that about the oxidation of the cholesterol with the with the animal fat. So yeah, you just taught me something there for sure. And I just want to ask you, one more question, because I know that we're kind of, getting close to our time here. But you seem to know quite a bit about markers for cardiovascular disease, and I know that you've done some work with, looking at the smaller particle size theory versus the larger particle size theory. And I think you've basically deemed that it doesn't really matter. So like an NMR particle size test, it doesn't really seem to have that much value overall. But what are your favorite cardiovascular markers to assess when you're doing blood work?
So I like the NMR panel, not because I think that the particle sizes are directly relevant, but they can indicate they can act as a proxy for other things. So
Okay.
like if someone has a bunch of small dense LDL particles, it strongly correlates with hepatic insulin resistance. And so just looking at that, even if like, let's say their blood sugar and everything is normal, just looking at that, it tells me there's stuff going on in their liver that needs to be addressed, probably the beginnings of fatty liver, that type of thing. And it's acting in a dysfunctional way. And so it can give you insights in that regard. But no, when you control for the total ApoB lipoprotein particle counts in the blood, the size of the particles is no longer a significant predictor of cardiovascular events. And so my favorite markers, I would say, for cardiovascular health, if we don't look at any kind of proxies, like if we just look at cardiovascular related things, and I say that because I like looking at glycemic markers, right? Because those are risk factors for cardiovascular disease. There's a lot of risk factors. But if we focus on cardio, all you need is a standard lipid panel. Ideally, you would get your ApoB directly assessed, which is pretty cheap to do. And I don't know why it's not standard currently, because it's the single most predictive risk factor that we have out of all the blood lipids. So I would assess your ApoB directly. I also like to see CRP, just because inflammation is a necessary requirement for atherosclerosis to occur. And homocysteine is one that I don't see people get ordered often, but I like looking at homocysteine because it not only directly harms your blood vessels and increases your cardiovascular disease risk, but it also represents your body's capacity for methylation reactions. And having elevated homocysteine means that your body's not able to do its necessary life-giving methylation reactions as optimally as it could. So you don't need much. I would say ApoB, CRP, and homocysteine would actually give you a lot of insight. And then if you want to throw other things on top of that and look at other relevant risk factors, like those related to glycemic control, insulin, that type of stuff, then, get those too.
Okay. Last question on that, and then we'll probably wrap things up. What about oxidized LDL?
I don't think it's relevant because LDL that's oxidized in circulation doesn't cause plaque. LDL particles move through the endothelium through transcytosis, which means that they bind to receptors and they get pulled into the cells and then moved into the subintimal, the right beneath the endothelium. And this process is fluid, so they move in and out, and that just happens naturally. You don't need endothelial damage for it to happen. It happens naturally, and the extent to which it happens is directly correlated to how many particles are in your blood and how permeable are your endothelium. And so the causal event in atherosclerosis is when those particles become trapped. And when they become trapped, that is when the ApoB particle becomes oxidized, and that makes macrophages come over and eat them up And then, they fill up with cholesterol, they become foam cells, and ultimately that's what forms the plaque. If the oxidized LDL is just circulating in your blood, it's not involved in that process. If it becomes trapped, it is. But any LDL that is part of that process is going to become oxidized as part of it already. So, if they're already oxidized circulating and they become trapped, it would be no different than a regular particle becoming trapped and then being oxidized, right? They're just doing the oxidation a little earlier.
Okay. Interesting. Well, thanks for clearing that up, because I've seen also too recently on social media, a lot of people talking about different, biomarkers for cardiovascular disease. And, I think we do have to thank Peter Attia for bringing up ApoB. And then he's also talked a lot about Lp(a), which, people are discussing now as well.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that too. Lp(a), getting that assessed is also really good, because Lp(a) still contains an ApoB lipoprotein, but it contains another lipoprotein molecule with it that increases its ability to bind to proteoglycans in the subendothelial space. And so it's more likely to become trapped and then initiate that process. And that's why it's such a strong risk factor for heart disease, is because it's more prone to initiating atherosclerosis than like regular LDL is.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I guess, a lot of people probably didn't know, why, Lp(a) was, so important or so critical. So thanks so much for clearing that up. I know our hour is up. We've actually a little more than an hour. So thanks so much, Alex, for, staying and giving us a little bit of extra time.
Yeah.
But before we say goodbye, can you just let everyone know, where they can connect with you, or a little bit more about your research and anything else that you want to promote, like your Twitter handle, your Instagram, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So if anyone wants to see my research or blog posts or anything like that, they can just go to alexleaf.com. So just a website with my first and last name. And then if they wanted to follow me on social media, I'm active on X and less so on Instagram. But in both cases, it would be Alex J. Leaf as my handle.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. I'd love to have you back on sometime, because, the answers to your questions were, just awesome. You cleared so many things up there today. And obviously, you know a lot about what you're talking about. So thanks so much again for coming on. And thanks so much, everyone, for listening. And as always, I'll be back with another episode soon.